Hello, I'm Professor Doug Cantrell from Elizabethtown Community Technical College. Today's lecture is titled Decades of Discord, 1875 to 1900. From 1875 to 1900, Kentucky developed a reputation as one of the most violent places in America due to the numerous feuds that rocked the state. It was during this time that the Appalachian stereotype developed. Kentucky's political system during the decades of discord was dependent on patronage and personal politics, characterized by localism and sectionalism, and dominated by lobbyists, voting blocs, and political bosses who ruled, as historian Robert Ireland said, their little kingdom. Party affiliation, more than anything else, defined how Kentuckians voted during the last decades of the 19th century. At the local level, politics was intensely personal, causing some individuals and families to avoid association with people who held different political views. Kinship ties were important to political success, as family members tended to vote in blocks, and successful candidates formed coalitions comprising as many extended families as possible. Voters and families expected rewards for supporting a winning candidate. At the local level, it was acceptable for candidates to appoint family members to local jobs, which meant that nepotism was common. Voters did not choose candidates based on issues of fitness for office, but on a candidate's willingness to reward voters and their family members with political favors, such as jobs. Each community had its leaders who voters listened to. Strong, strong kinship connections were present that local politicians had to recognize each local community had its interests to protect. Localism was only one component of politics in Kentucky. County government was set up so that each county was semi-autonomous. Isolation meant that county government was virtually the only government that most Kentuckians had any contact with. Each county official had important powers. County judges granted liquor license at his discretion. Sheriffs collected taxes. Justices of the peace, there were 2,000 in Kentucky in 1889, tried cases at the local level involving petty crime. County courts recorded legal documents, and county assessors evaluated property for tax purposes. Local governments, not states or the federal government, built roads, enforced most laws, collected most taxes, and dispensed all poor relief. These activities were not always done fairly or effectively, largely depending on political affiliation and who was in office at the time. By the time McQuarrie County, Kentucky's latest county, was created in 1912, Kentucky's counties were on average the smallest in size in the United States. In larger areas like Louisville, politics operated in a fashion similar to rural areas, but on a different stage. Papa John Whalen and his brother James built an urban political machine in the 1880s that relied upon the Catholic and Irish voters for its power base. The Whalen machine provided jobs in the police force and in city government, assisted needy residents with rent or groceries, and gave gifts to selected residents on special occasions. In return for these favors, Papa Whalen and politicians he backed received sufficient votes to enable them to control Louisville's government. The Whalens owned the Buckingham Burlesque Theater, where patrons could pay to watch scantily clad showgirls while enjoying alcoholic drinks in the saloon. Behind the stage, in what was called the green room, Papa and his henchmen made or broke promising political careers. Most smaller towns and cities throughout the state and nation had machines similar to Louisville's Buckingham Burlesque bosses, whose goals were to control votes and win elections. Sometimes forces such as powerful lobbies disrupted local power. During the 19th century, Kentucky's most powerful lobby was the Louisville-Nashville Railroad. This corporation, which paid 40% of all railroad taxes to the Commonwealth in 1900, and Milton Hannibal, its CEO, viewed all legislative bodies as a menace. Hannibal tried to control all legislative bodies in Kentucky as much as possible to reduce the risk to the L&N. Numerous politicians were on the L&N payroll in counties where the rail line passed. They were generally retained as attorneys for the railroad. Most Kentucky politicians received free passage to travel on the railroad that they and their family members could use. The L&N also told the thousands of workers the line employed and their families how to vote. Most Kentucky politicians partook of the L&N's lavish entertainment, drinking free whiskey and eating free food. Kentuckians generally believed that without the L&N's blessing, it was impossible for a politician to be elected to any office. In addition to the L&N, other lobbies for lotteries, coal companies, agricultural interests, and the thoroughbred industry existed in Kentucky. None, however, lasted as long or controlled state government to the degree that the L&N did. The lobbies, political localism, and the expectation of rewards for votes created an atmosphere in Kentucky that accepted corruption in the voting booth. Vote buying was common in Kentucky elections. Politicians often bought votes with money, whiskey, or something else. Even use of the secret ballot did not stop the corruption. In 1909, an estimate suggested that about one-fourth of votes in all counties could be bought. In 1911, a gubernatorial candidate said that 70,000 votes were bought every election, in many places for $1 or some whiskey. Vote buying in Kentucky was a practice that continued well into the 20th century. Transient miners in eastern Kentucky County would often be taken en masse to vote several times in different precincts on the same day. Elections are often fixed by corrupt party bosses due to the practice of counting votes on the day after an election was held. Local party officials would call party headquarters to see if an election was closed, and if it was, ask how many votes the party needed to win. In these close elections, both parties held back vote totals for as long as possible to counter suspicious late results favorable to the other party. Violence often broke out at polling places on election day because Kentucky was immense in violence. Fist fights and gunplay was somewhat common in the state, and the violence did not go away for decades once it began. Although formally constituted lawless groups such as the Ku Klux Klan did not survive readjustment, the organization's name was often attached to self-styled regulator groups that arose in the Commonwealth from time to time. These groups tried to place their own interpretation of the law on people living in their community. These regulators generally contribute to the laws that pervaded Kentucky in the 19th century. Although such groups often maintained they were administering justice, they actually decided guilt and inflicted punishment arbitrarily and willfully without trial by jury. Not hearing evidence, without the right of due process outside a court of law, and without the right to appeal a guilty verdict. The concept of vigilante justice does not and cannot exist. Threats and beatings were common in areas where regulators operated. Lynching also occurred upon occasion in areas where regulators operated. Between 1875 and 1900, at least 166 lynchings occurred in Kentucky. Two-thirds of the people lynched were black. Mobs often murdered people with impunity. In October 1899, Richard Coleman, an accused murderer, was taken from the sheriff in Maysville. Hundreds of people watched as Coleman was thrown into a fire, dying a slow, agonizing death. The mob then dragged Coleman's body through Maysville streets, where residents cut off the deceased man's fingers and toes as souvenirs. Even though Coleman's killers did not wear masks and were well known in the town, no charges were ever filed against them. Many other similar incidents happened throughout the state. After the federal government placed an excise tax on whiskey in 1862, moonshine became common throughout Kentucky as farmers refused to pay the tax on their product. Federal revenue agents tried to seize the illegal steals and arrest the violators. In 1881, for example, 153 moonshining arrests were made. Most communities, however, tactically accepted moonshining, protecting the moonshiner from revenue agents. Sometimes revenue agents met violence when they attempted to raid illegal steals. Violence was often accepted in Kentucky during the last decades of century 19. Many Kentuckians found violence acceptable when a person's honor was questioned. Congressman Philip B. Thompson Jr., for example, killed a man he said had debauched his wife. A jury of local residents acquitted the congressman when he was tried for murder in 1883. Louisville Times reporter Charles E. Kincaid killed Congressman William P. Talby in 1890 after ending Talby's career by printing a story alleging the married congressman was caught having sex with a young woman in the U.S. Patent's office. Talby threatened Kincaid when they encountered each other. 2 hours later, Kincaid killed Talby in a hallway of the U.S. Capitol building. Kincaid confessed to the murder but was set free by a jury who said he was allowed to defend his honor. In Louisville, an angry husband killed his wife and the son of former Governor John Young Brown when he found them in bed together, but was acquitted of murder because the jury thought he was allowed personal revenge in cases of adultery. Kentucky society generally tolerated and perhaps approved of violence for personal revenge. Violence was endemic in Kentucky, partly because the legal system was broken. In some communities, the entire judicial system was tainted. Trial and grand juries in some places were comprised of criminals, their relatives, and friends. Legal systems in most communities were firmly controlled by one party or political faction that favored its members and persecuted the opposition. In these localities, grand juries refused to indict factional members, and when indicted, the courts refused to convict. In rare cases where conviction occurred, governors often rewarded political allies by pardoning their friends serving prison time. As might be expected, law enforcement personnel faced danger in such a violent environment. Judges in particular faced threats and violence. In March 1879, Judge John Milton Elliott was shot and killed on the streets of Frankfort by Thomas Buford, a Henry County man upset over a decision Elliott had made in a previous court case. Buford was found insane and sentenced to an asylum from which he escaped, remaining free in Indiana for 2 years before coming back to Kentucky, where he died in the asylum in 1885. Even state militia units dispatched to enforce the law were not immune from violence. After 3 Ashland men were arrested for murder in 1882, a lynch mob killed one of the suspects. The state militia was ordered to protect the 2 remaining suspects, but was attacked by a mob as the prisoners were being removed to a safe jail. This Battle of Ashland, as it is called, resulted in several wounded soldiers and 4 dead civilians. The 1880s was certainly a lawless time in Kentucky. Some Kentuckians railed against the violence. Newspaper editors sometimes urged an end to the violence, asking Kentuckians to stop encouraging violence as a means of gaining personal retribution. Much of the violence resulted from a southern subculture that was heavily oriented toward violence. Cultural mores accepted violence and it became part of life in Kentucky. Feuds were the most notorious forms of violence in Kentucky during the latter decades of the 19th century. Feud violence is defined as hostilities between families or clans that occurred over time motivated by revenge. Kentucky's feuds destroyed lives, broke families, and gave the state a bad name nationally. Although most feuds occurred in Appalachian eastern Kentucky, a few took place elsewhere. The Hills-Evans feud of Garrett County originated in 1820, erupted in full force in the 1850s, continued throughout the Civil War, and ended in 1877 when, according to one report, only one male in both families remained alive. Exaggeration and biased accounts often make it hard to fully understand feuds. The Underwood-Stamper, Holbrook feud in Carter County is an example of such a feud that is not clearly understood. This conflict possibly was more of a struggle between regulators and outlaws than a feud, but it did involve family seeking revenge that stemmed from an earlier Kenny-Carter conflict. In 1877, ambushes rekindled the old feud, and the Underwood family faced attack from the Stamper family, a local regulator group, and a state militia unit. Although the death toll is not certain, perhaps 30 deaths may have occurred. In 1880, rumors circulated that a band of over 200 regulators enforced clan justice in Carter County. The Round County War, or the Martin-Tolliver-Logan feud during the 1880s, was a particularly bloody conflict near Moorhead. At least 20 people were killed and 16 wounded during the 3-year period that this conflict occurred. This feud began over political disagreements in the 1870s but erupted in full force in the 1884 election dispute that killed one and wounded John Martin and another man. Several months later, Martin accused Big Floyd Tolliver of the earlier shooting and killed him in a saloon. 8 days later, the Tollivers captured Martin from a jail using a forged court order and shot him to death. Afterwards, each side murdered people from the other side. Eventually, the Tollivers gained control of Moorhead and County Court. This prompted Daniel Boone Logan, whose 2 cousins were murdered by the Tollivers, to request aid from the governor. After Logan's request for aid was denied, he purchased rifles and ammunition to arm a force of 120 to 200 men, surrounded Moorhead, catching the Tollivers in a crossfire as they exited a burning building, killing the leader and 3 others. The governor then pardoned the Logans, and a later legislative investigation found inept, inefficient, corrupt, and depraved county government and recommended that Round County be abolished. Other feuds in Kentucky's eastern mountains also attracted attention. One was the Harrod-Turner feud in Harlan County, which began before the Civil War. During the 1870s, isolated murders occurred, and in 1889, a pitched battle between the warring families occurred, when the Turners withstood a long siege in Harlan Town's courthouse. By the end of June 1889, estimates indicate that 50 people died over a 10-year period. Another feud that saw both sides meeting in a pitched battle was the French Eversole War in Prairie County. In 1880, both families fought a two-day battle in the streets of Hazard. That battle did not end the feud, which continued into the 1890s, leaving from 40 to 50 participants dead. Kentucky's most famous feud, the Hatfield-McCoy feud, was not the bloodiest, longest lasting, or most spectacular of the state's numerous feuds. It did, however, receive much national media coverage because it involved two state governments. This conflict became synonymous with mountain feuding. Disputes over the Civil War, failed justice, a hog, timber, and land, and a romantic betrothal gave rise to this feud, which erupted in earnest on Election Day in 1882. On that day, a fight between a Hatfield and three McCoys left the Hatfields severely wounded. Devil Anse, or William Anderson Hatfield, leader of the West Virginia Hatfields, distrustful Pike County justice, captured the three McCoys, tied them to pawpaw bushes on the Tug River, and when his wounded brother died, shot about 50 bullets into the bound prisoners, which included a 15-year-old boy. Over the next 5 years, scattered incidents took place between the Hatfields and McCoys. On New Year's Day in 1888, old Randall McCoy leader's home was surrounded and burned. This attack killed a son and daughter and seriously wounded old Randall's wife, Aunt Sally McCoy. Later, an illegal raid by a Pike County deputy sheriff across Tug River into West Virginia resulted in the deaths and arrests of several Hatfields. The ensuing court case involved the governors of Kentucky and West Virginia as well as the U.S. Supreme Court. Feud ended in 1890 after Ellison Mounts was legally hanged by Kentucky authorities. Devil Anse retreated to a fortress deep in the West Virginia mountains where he lived to a ripe old age. Overall, the feud killed at least 12 and perhaps as many as 20 individuals and captured America's attention. About the time that the Hatfield-McCoy feud ended, the Baker-White feud in Clay County reached its apex. This feud's origins are traceable to an 1840s murder. Then, Dr. Abner Baker, who was insane at the time, murdered one of the Whites. Business rivalries later caused the feud to heat up during the 1890s, and a ferocious battle was fought in the Manchester courthouse. Even though the estimate of 50 deaths from the feud is probably high, the conflict killed a number of Clay County residents. The Amma-Strong Little feud in Breathitt County was Kentucky's last official feud and one of the longest lasting. The trouble that ignited this feud is traceable to the Civil War. After the war ended, the feud heated up. In 1874, the state militia was sent to Jackson after one faction fortified the courthouse. In 1878, a Little was arrested for killing his pregnant wife. Family members killed the county judge, and the circuit court judge vanished. A mob again seized the Jackson courthouse, and anarchy existed in bloody Breathitt County. The governor had to dispatch the militia to impose a forced peace. Out of this feud grew the Hargis-Markham-Cockrell-Callum feud. James Hargis, a Democratic county judge and businessman, aided by Sheriff Ed Callahan, led one group. The opposing group was led by Republican lawyer James B. Markham and town marshal Tom Cockrell. Both sides had ties to the previous feud. In two separate incidents, Hargis's brother and half-brother were murdered, and in July 1902, Cockrell's brother Jim was killed as Hargis and Callahan watched. These deaths ignited the violence, which by November 1902 had claimed 30 victims. Markham, fearing for his life, would not go outside without having a child in his arms. In May 1903, Markham was shot. 2 convictions of murder were achieved at trial, but Hargis and Callahan were found innocent. In 1908, Hargis was killed by his drunken son, and Callahan was assassinated after answering a telephone call at a store window in 1912. Callahan's murder ended this feud in bloody Breathitt County. Even though Kentucky's feud had ended by 1912, the state paid a heavy cost for the violence. The bloody ghost of the feuds would haunt Kentuckians for most of the 20th century in the form of the hillbilly stereotype. Although each feud was different in its origins, several characteristics were common in most. First, leading citizens within a county, lawyers, doctors, judges, etc., were often involved, and one or more factions were generally headed by entrepreneurial business types such as Devil Anse Hatfield, owner of a lumber company that logged on thousands of acres of land in the Tug River Valley. Hired guns operated under the control of the feud leader, who cared for those under his control much as a medieval lord cared for his men. A second characteristic of feud was that the violence that occurred within them was cruel and cowardly. Despite the romantic images of mountain people defending their code of honor conveyed by writers at the time the feuds occurred, little good came from the feud violence. Most feud deaths resulted from ambushes and assassinations. Courthouses were seized, laws were broken, pitched battles without regard for the safety of innocent bystanders were fought, and other dastardly deeds were part of the feuds. Honor was seldom a part of these actions. A third and final characteristic of the feuds is that all followed a similar pattern and contained common events. Anger escalated into violence because of past political partisanship, economic rivalries, the carrying of concealed weapons, and intense localisms fed by a restrictive isolation of common elements of various feuds. A factor that Atina Waller and other historians discovered that played a role in various feuds was a sort of urban-rural conflict where outside industrial forces changed the traditional life of mountain residents. However, the main reason that so much feud violence erupted in Kentucky was lawlessness and the inability or unwillingness of law enforcement personnel to stop the violence. Individuals, unable to obtain justice in a corrupt legal system, sometimes took the law into their own hands. A type of family-oriented vigilantism developed, and each bloody act produced a similar act of retaliation and eventually revenge, not justice, guiding feud participants. As previously stated, the feuds would have a costly impact on Kentucky. One effect was an exodus of citizens from the feud areas, a business depression in the feud counties, and little overall growth. Another effort was the negative publicity that helped create untrue stereotypes within the larger nation about Kentuckians. Two contradictory images developed in the national consciousness about Kentucky. One portrayed Appalachian residents of eastern Kentucky as our contemporary ancestors, isolated by geography from the rest of America. As a result, mountaineers spoke Shakespearean English, maintained old values, and lived self-sufficient lives in mountain cabins where they sang ancient ballads accompanied by dulcimer music. A second stereotype portrayed eastern Kentuckians as ignorant, uncivilized savages who were prone to violence and immoral lives lived filled with fornication with kin. This image pictured Kentuckians as ignorant, backward hillbillies with a feuding rifle in one hand and a jug of moonshine in the other. Leading historian Arnold Toynbee to conclude in 1934 that mountain people were little better than barbarians. Eventually, this stereotype of a people who mainly fuss, feud, and fornicate expanded to include all of Kentucky. Americans in general saw Kentucky as a lawless place best avoided. Newspapers such as the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, along with popular magazines such as Leslie's Monthly, during the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and into the 20th century, printed articles referring to Kentuckians as unreclaimed savages, effective assassins, and called Kentucky a delightful place to live if one enjoys anarchy and mobocracy and a land where the sun set crimson and the moon rose red. These stereotypes ignored the complexities of Kentucky life. In fact, great differences existed among people within the state. There was poverty and wealth, log cabins and brick mansions, traditional society and modern society. The Kentucky of stereotypes seldom existed. Outside writers often had their views of Kentucky colored by urban provincialism and cultural colonialism. Many bought into stereotypes without ever venturing far into the area they wrote about. Even though the stereotypes of the forgotten pioneer and the violent hillbilly was not accurate portrayals of Kentuckians, once established in the American mind, they would be difficult to change, enduring to this very day, haunting Kentucky's image and hindering economic development. Violence was a key issue in the 1875 governor's election. Democrats were criticized by Republicans for failing to contain the violence. They promised to do better in the future. The candidates in this election were Republican John Marshall Harlan and Democrat James B. McQuarrie. Former Confederate Colonel McQuarrie, like most Democrats at this time, emphasized his ties to the antebellum South. Harlan, in contrast, focused on state issues. McQuarrie, when he was not waving the bloody shirt, emphasized his service in the Civil War, talked about Reconstruction and other national issues. McQuarrie easily won by a vote of 130,026 to 94,236, making him the youngest governor ever elected in Kentucky up to that time. Controversy quickly engulfed the new administration. Labor, both agricultural and urban, demanded a louder voice in state government. Farmers were concerned about railroad and business issues because the value of farm goods had declined by 27% during the 1870s. Consequently, farm organizations arose to expound the agrarian view. One such organization was the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange as it was more popularly called. Although many Grange views were conservative, some of its ideas were radical for that time. Grangers formed cooperative stores and warehouses and advocated a revision of the country's financial structure, which they believed favored business at the expense of farmers. Many Kentucky farmers agreed with these ideas, and by 1875, about 1,500 Granges with over 50,000 members existed in the Commonwealth, making Kentucky one of the largest grain states in the South. Other organizations attracted Kentucky farmers as well. The Greenback Party, which favored printing more paper money to create inflation, which would raise prices for farm commodities and make it easier for farmers to pay debt, attracted some support from Kentucky farmers. In the 1880s and 1890s, the Agricultural Wheel and the Farmers Alliance, which morphed into the Populist Party, fought for agricultural interests. These organizations advocated inflation through the free coins of silver, nationalization of banks and railroads, a graduated income tax, the direct election of U.S. senators, use of the secret ballot during elections, and agricultural pride. The Farmers Alliance and other agricultural groups threatened existing political order in Kentucky. Democrats feared that angry farmers would leave the party unless their issues were addressed. However, McQuarrie and other Democratic leaders had to walk a careful line because if they went too far in meeting agrarian interests, they might tread on other business interests in the party, splintering an already fragile Democratic coalition. Farmers were not the only dissatisfied Kentuckians. Labor unrest broke out in urban areas as a result of a prolonged recession that engulfed the nation for most of the last decade of century 19. After the L&N and other railroads cut wages in 1877, angry workers went on strike in Louisville, shouting down the mayor and damaging several buildings. A national union, the Knights of Labor, began organizing in Kentucky. By 1880, it had 36 locals in Louisville. From 1880 to 1900, Louisville had at least 140 strikes, most of them over wage issues. In 1887, for example, working women struck at the Louisville Woolen Mills. In 1893, a 2-month strike rocked the city after the Panic of 1893 caused about 10,000 workers to lose their jobs. Unfortunately, workers won few battles with management in Kentucky, but the conflict produced a class consciousness among workers, cementing them into an important voting bloc Kentucky's dominant Democratic Party had to deal with. Despite the threats from farmers and workers, Democrats continued to win most Kentucky elections. Samuel J. Tilden, the party's presidential nominee in the 1876 election, easily carried the state by 160,445 to 98,415 vote total over Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes, winning the vote in all 10 congressional districts due to some creative gerrymandering. Hayes, amid much controversy caused by Republican cheating in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, won the presidency after Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans struck a deal known as the Compromise of 1877, giving Republicans the presidency and ending Reconstruction in southern states, giving Democrats complete control of the states of the former Confederacy. Henry Watterson, upset over the election, called for 10,000 Kentuckians to march to Washington in protest, but nothing came of this angry request. Even though the Democratic Party generally lost the national presidential elections, it still controlled practically all offices in Kentucky. Governor McQuarrie, to placate the Grange, passed numerous laws addressing agrarian concerns. These laws established the Bureau of Agriculture, reduced the property tax by 11%, lowered the maximum interest rate to 6%, provided for fish conservation, made the Agricultural Mechanical College, now University of Kentucky, an independent school, and created a state board of health. Creation of the State Board of Health was a measure long overdue as Kentucky residents faced numerous health problems. Epidemics of cholera, smallpox, yellow fever, and typhoid killed thousands each year. Consumption of contaminated food and water added to the death toll each year. Poor sanitation in homes, such as drinking from the same dipper in the water bucket, quickly spread diseases. Tuberculosis and hookworm infestations were common. Estimates indicate that in the 19-teens, about 1/3 of all Kentuckians had hookworm and 1/4 had trachoma, a disease that could cause blindness. Paducah in 1900 had America's second highest rate of typhoid fever and its third highest rate of malaria. Little effective treatment was available to combat these and other diseases. Because the government did not regulate the pharmaceutical industry, Patent medicine manufacturers widely advertise cures for virtually all diseases. For example, Dr. Radway's sarsaparilla resolvent was supposed to cure tuberculosis, syphilis, ulcers, sore eyes, skin diseases, ringworm, female complaints, and nocturnal losses. Most patent medicines were worthless. Addictive drugs sold legally without prescription in drugstores, such as morphine, cocaine, and opium, were often used to self treat diseases. Addicts were then barraged with newspaper advertisements for other drugs that would cure the addiction. Dr. Joseph N. McCormick, director of the newly established Board of Health, with a budget that never exceeded $5,000, tried to improve the health of Kentuckians. The first issue, the State Board of Health addressed was medical preparation for doctors. A study in 1878 concluded 1,000 of Kentucky's 5,000 doctors had not attended medical school. Kentucky's doctors are generally ill equipped to treat illness in a scientific way. Because government did not regulate medical schools, attendance at such institutions did not ensure that doctors were properly trained. A second issue Dr. McCormick addressed was food safety. 1898, the legislature passed a pure food law that allowed state inspection of processed and prepared food items. This law, especially after its revision and strengthening, lessened the contamination of Kentucky's food supply. Aiding the cause was Robert McDowell Allen, who became a nationally known expert in food safety. Punishment of violators of Kentucky's pure food law began to make Kentucky food safer. The health of Kentuckians began to improve in the 20th century due to state regulation of medical schools, stronger food and drug laws, and a better educated population. Dr. Luke Pryor Blackburn defeated Republican Walter Evans and Green Party candidate C.W. Cook for Kentucky's governorship in 1879. Cook, who represented farm and labor interests, got more than 8% of the popular vote. Controversy engulfed much of Blackburn's term. An important issue during the campaign was Blackburn's effort to aid the Confederacy by infecting northern cities with yellow fever. But this black mark on his record was offset by his fight against the disease throughout the South. His effort to fight yellow fever during an 1878 outbreak earned him the title Hero of Hickman. Blackburn became known for prison reform, as this was the single issue that dominated his administration. When Blackburn took office, Kentucky's prisons were horrible institutions. State government leased the Frankfort Penitentiary and its inmates to the highest bidder. Each leasee kept expenses low, worked convicts at various tasks, and sold the product. Inmates were poorly housed, poorly clad, and worked like slaves for private interest. About 7% of all prisoners died each year from diseases such as cholera, pneumonia, and scurvy from the unhealthy, filthy conditions they endured in prison. Prison employees, including guards, were hired as part of the patronage system. Lacked training and turnover rates were high. Leases often bribed politicians who in turn did little to improve the situation. Prisoners were frequently whipped, ate food laced with cockroaches, lived in rat-infested cells, endured thumbscrews, sickness, and death. Because Kentucky did not have a parole system, most prisoners served the full term unless pardoned by the governor, which usually only went to those with political connections. Dr. Blackburn examined the deplorable prison situation and concluded that changes were needed. The first thing he did was to relieve prison overcrowding by pardoning a large number of inmates, for which he was dubbed Lenient Luke by political opponents. All told, Blackburn issued over 1,000 pardons before his 4-year term ended. Prison reform legislation was introduced in the General Assembly in 1880. A bill authorizing construction of a new prison passed but was not funded. This bill also set up a warden system, which made the state responsible for the care of inmates rather than leasees, and established a rudimentary parole system. One aspect of the bill, however, caused much prisoner abuse. In an attempt to end overcrowding, the bill allowed contractors to lease convicts for work outside the prison walls. Unfortunately, contractors did not treat prisoners well. At one labor camp, half the 50 inmates died. Some were reported as escaped when in fact they had died from malnourishment, overwork, and beatings. Attempts to regulate convict leasing failed. Kentucky's inmates continued to work in unbearable conditions at mines, railroads, reservoirs, and other places until the new state constitution prohibited convict leasing when it was written in the 1890s. Overall, Blackburn's efforts to reform prisons was only partly successful. When the new penitentiary at Eddyville was constructed, it would be failed almost immediately. Problems in Kentucky's prisons continued for several more decades. In addition to prison reform, Blackburn's administration raised property taxes, cut state salaries by 20%, improved river navigation, and reorganized the court system. By the time his term ended, Governor Blackburn had few allies, even within his own party. After Blackburn's term expired, the Democratic Party continued to dominate Kentucky politics, supporting Winfield Scott Hancock in the 1880 presidential election and re-electing James B. Beck to the U.S. Senate. In 1883, Democrats elected J. Proctor Knott governor. He defeated Republican Thomas Z. Monroe by 133,615 to 89,180 votes, partly due to fame garnered for his witty Duluth speech in 1871. Like many previous governors, Knott's reform-oriented proposals were stymied by powerful lobbyists, party factionalism, and a local mindset. Knott was unable to stop the Rowan County War and, like Blackburn, issued numerous pardons. He did, however, create the Kentucky State Normal School for Colored Persons, now Kentucky State University, in Frankfort, and enacted a major reform of the state's educational system. Knott's major accomplishment was revenue reform. A new law established new taxes, raised the property tax, established more uniform tax assessments that taxed railroads and corporations the same rate as private citizens. The change in the corporate tax rate added $90 million worth of profit to the state's tax roll. As a result of these tax reforms, state revenue rose to $3.6 billion by 1890, a 50% growth over the 1880 figure. This growth occurred despite passage of a bill back to the L&N granting newly constructed rail lines, about one-fourth of all railroads operating in Kentucky, a 5-year period free of taxes. During Knott's administration, Kentucky voters finally picked the winner in a national presidential election, supporting Democrat Grover Cleveland over Republican James G. Blaine by a vote of 152,961 to 118,122 in a hard-fought 1884 election that questioned the personal character and integrity of both men. Cleveland was the first Democrat elected president since 1856, and Kentucky Democrats anticipated the federal patronage and other reward from the new administration. The 1887 gubernatorial election was also a hard-fought affair between Republican William O. Bradley and Democrat Simon Bolivar Buckner. Buckner defeated Bradley in a fairly close election, getting 51% of the vote, or 143,446 votes, to Bradley's 126,754. This election was Kentucky's closest since the Civil War. Over 12,000 votes went to third-party candidates. This election clearly showed that the dominant Democratic faction had developed cracks. Democratic problems under Buckner's rule worsened. Spurred on by agrarian interest and the Farmers Alliance, the legislature slashed property taxes so much that the governor had to personally loan the state treasury $50,000 to keep the state financially solvent. Buckner also vetoed over 100 bills passed by the Kentucky legislature during his term in office. His veto total represented more vetoes than his 10 predecessors combined. A legislative investigation caused by actions of the powerful L&N lobby concluded that the railroad had used money, passes, and influence to dominate and control the legislature. Buckner also became embroiled in controversy with West Virginia's governor over the Hatfield-McCoy feud that was eventually settled by the U.S. Supreme Court. The biggest problem Buckner faced, however, was a political scandal involving State Treasurer James W. Honest Dick Tate. Honest Dick was so liked and respected for his integrity that state officials did not bother to check his accounts, and voters elected him over and over to the position of state treasurer. On March 14, 1888, Honest Dick left for Louisville on what he said was a short trip. He was never seen again. Honest Dick had left the state, taking money from the treasury with him. Once investigators examined his books, they found that bills had not been paid, that Tate had made personal loans to friends, and government officials that Tate had invested tax revenue in speculative land and mining ventures, and that he had filled 2 large sacks with gold and silver coin and had taken a large roll of bills with him on his Louisville trip. Overall, Tate had embezzled $247,000 from the state treasury, doctored bills, deleted accounts, and kept poor records. His fraud continued unabated for 15 years due to loose state controls. Worry over a possible check of his accounts apparently caused Tate to flee. The House of Representatives quickly impeached Tate, and the Senate removed him from office. Criminal charges were lodged against him in court, and to prevent another such incident in the future, the legislature created the Office of State Inspector and Examiner. Elected state officials were worried and distanced themselves from Tate to minimize dangers to their political careers, paying long overdue IOUs from Tate. Even though the state auditor had clearly been derelict in his duties, he got off with only a public censure. Several wealthy, influential people who had signed as bondsmen also got off relatively easily. Presumably, any shortage in the state treasury would be made up from the bondsman's funds. Given the magnitude of the theft and the fact that several private fortunes would be lost, the state Supreme Court decided not to hold the bondsman liable. This decision was not widely reported because of the political consequence it likely would entail. Nobody knows for certain what happened to Tate or where he went after he left Kentucky. His wife and daughter, who were left behind in Frankfort, said that they received secret letters for a brief period indicating they'd gone to Canada, to Asia, to California, and finally Brazil. No more letters were sent, and presumably he died in a foreign country, perhaps returned to the U.S. under an assumed identity. Tate's actions are nothing new. In 1876, Richard Hall, son of the former Confederate governor and the city treasurer Covington, embezzled $57,000 but was pardoned by Governor Blackburn. Thefts such as that by Hall and Tate increased distrust of all public officials and led angry critics to charge that a cover-up had occurred. Tate's embezzlement had a lasting impact on state government, and particularly on the new Constitution that was written. Term limits on state officials would be imposed by that Constitution to prevent a reoccurrence of the honest Dick Tate affair. By the 1880s, it became clear that changes in Kentucky's government and Constitution were needed. The 1850 Constitution still allowed slavery and gave government little control of railroads and other corporations. 1889 vote authorized the convention to write a new state constitution. 100 delegates is elected from each district in Kentucky's House of Representatives met in Frankfort on September 8, 1890. This meeting continued for 226 days, resulting in the signing of a new state constitution on April 11, 1891. The delegates were a varied lot: 60 lawyers, 20 farmers, 13 doctors, and 7 businessmen. 1/5 were members of the Farmers Alliance and favored limited government, regulation of corporations, railroad regulation, inflated currency, and other things dear to agrarians. Others included professional politicians, the current governor, former governor, a future governor, relatives of a governor, and several mid-level office holders. These delegates are generally considered competent but were not exceptional. Because no single individual stepped forward to lead the convention delegates, Kentucky's Constitution was written using a piecemeal approach rather than by use of a considered approach. The Constitution often floundered as delegates debated minor details or argued for countless hours over procedural issues. Delegates made a serious error when they ignored the advice of William N. Becker to write a flexible constitution. Instead, the document they produced was rigid and many of its sections became quickly outdated. Because delegates were distrustful of government officials after the Tate affair, the Constitution severely restricted officials' time in office and restricted also the power of virtually all office holders. The 1891 Constitution, because of its inflexibility, would have to be amended many times over the years. Its chief provisions included retention of the Bill of Rights from the 1792 Constitution, a bicameral legislature comprised of a 100-member House of Representatives elected to 2-year terms and a 38-member Senate elected to 4-year terms, an executive branch comprised of the governor and other constitutional officers elected to 4-year terms, a state court system headed by a 5 to 7-member Court of Appeals elected to 8-year terms, and a system of circuit, quarterly, county, justice of the peace, and police courts. A railroad commission to regulate railroads operating in Kentucky. Lotteries were established. Salaries of state officials were restricted to $5,000 per year. State elections were moved from August to November and will be held by secret ballot rather than voice voting, and only males over 21 years of age were granted suffrage. A racially segregated public school system was authorized. Creation of new counties was made more difficult. Kentucky's new Constitution was criticized by Watterson and others almost as soon as it was written. They disliked its limitations, its inflexibility, and its reform. The ONN in particular campaigned unsuccessfully against its adoption. Kentucky voters adopted the Constitution by 212,914 to 74,523 votes. Delegates then unexpectedly met again for nearly a month, making several changes in the document before signing what they called a final draft. This draft was never voted on or approved by Kentucky's population, but the courts eventually declared final draft to be the legal constitution for Kentucky. The 1891 Constitution created numerous problems for the Commonwealth. As previously stated, the Democratic coalition consists of many factions: former Whigs, former Unionists, pre-war Democrats, rural interests, urban interests, rich bluegrass farmers, poor Western Kentucky farmers, bourbon conservatives, New Departure Democrats, and others. Their bonds were weak, but generally they supported low tariffs, limited government, and opposition to Republican rule. The Democrats had never had a united party. One faction was always in opposition to another. Bourbons opposed New Departure Democrats, farmers opposed business, urban opposed rural. Over the years, factions broke from the main party, sometimes supporting third parties. The 1890s difference within the party threatened its very existence. Farmers faced economic difficulty as the American Industrial Revolution moved onward. Agrarians complained that corporations and railroads discriminated against them, charging excessively high rates to ship farm goods. Farmers also complained about the long-term debt owed to banks and about the political system. As noted before, various organizations, the Grangers, the Greenbacks, the Agrarian Wheel, had tried to address agrarian issues. The organization that came closest to meeting the needs of farmers was the Farmers Alliance, which became the Populist Party. Organized in Kentucky formally as the Farmer and Laborers Union, over 125,000 farmers held membership in the 2,400 sub-unions of the Farmers Alliance that operate in 88 counties. Because of its size, the Farmers Alliance and its president, S. Brewer Irwin, quickly became a force to be reckoned with in Kentucky politics. Because between 1886, when the group was first established in Kentucky, until 1891, that power had been exercised in the Democratic Party. In 1891, however, agrarians threatened to break away from the Democrats and create a party representing only farm interests. Farmers across the state were particularly concerned after Democrats nominated John Young Brown as the party's gubernatorial candidate. Many farmers believed Brown represented the old party leadership and would not address agrarian concerns. Disgruntled farmers who had attended a national farm protest meeting in Cincinnati crossed the Ohio River to Covington and found the People's or Populist Party and nominated a slate of candidates for the 1891 governor's race. Irwin, the Populist nominee, mainly stressed concerns of Kentucky farmers. He avoided the primary issues the National Populist Party emphasized in 1892. However, both the Republican and the Democratic parties regarded the Populists as dangerous radicals because of their stand on relief. Farmers who faced hard economic times sought relief, calling for the free coins of silver at a set ratio, 16 ounces of silver being equal to 1 ounce of gold. What farmers wanted was an inflated currency that would raise prices for farm goods and enable farmers to pay off debt with cheaper dollars. Republicans and part of Kentucky's Democratic Party supported sound currency, while one part of the Democratic Party joined Populists in advocating free silver. In the 1891 election, Brown won because the Farmers Alliance refused to endorse the third party, defeating Republican Andrew T. Wood and Populist Irwin. Because Irwin received over 25,000 votes, Democrats did not receive a majority of votes cast. The Populist Party got about 9% of all Kentucky votes. The potential for future problems existed and threatened Democratic control of the state. A particular concern for the Democrats was Western Kentucky. Of the 44 counties where Irwin had gained more than 10% of the vote, most were in the heavily agricultural and economically oppressed area of Western Kentucky. Populists had elected 13 members of the General Assembly, and a large number of Democrats, backed by the Farmers Alliance, gave agricultural interests majority control of the state legislature. This meant that the issue of inflation and other agricultural concerns had to be addressed. Democrats feared that if these issues were not adequately dealt with, the party faced almost certain defeat in future elections. Governor Brown, operating under the new Constitution, had to face these issues. The situation was so chaotic in Frankfort that the legislature remained in session almost continuously from December 1891 to July 1893, earning it the name the Long Parliament. Brown, his lieutenant governor, and his cabinet feuded so much that two factions developed within the executive branch. The Long Parliament passed legislation that was both reactionary and that addressed some of the agrarian concerns. One law gave property rights to married women, but another law required racially segregated railroad coaches. A limited coal mine safety act was also enacted, but the ongoing geological survey was ended because of its expense. Brown vetoed a bill increasing railroad taxes, but later he disallowed the merger of the L&N with Chesapeake and Ohio. Nobody seemed to be in charge of state government and knew what was going on. At the national level, Democrats faced a similar rift with agrarians and a challenge from populists. In the 1892 presidential election, the choice of Kentucky voters, Democrat Grover Cleveland returned to office. Kentucky voters gave Cleveland a 40,000 vote margin within the Commonwealth. 23,500 votes, or 7% of the state total, however, went to the populist candidate General James B. Weaver. Republican President Benjamin Harrison finished a distant second nationally and statewide. President Cleveland recognized Kentucky Democrats by appointing John G. Carlisle as Secretary of the Treasury. He was the most prominent Kentuckian in national politics at this time, having previously served as a member of both the U.S. House and Senate, rising to the position of Speaker of the House. The national depression and the fact that Carlisle and Cleveland both supported the sound currency made them unpopular nationally and in Kentucky. After being pelted by rotten eggs when making a speech supporting sound currency in 1896, Carlisle declined to speak public again, giving up politics and moving from Kentucky. Republicans believed that Democratic problems in the 1890s gave them a shot at winning the governor's race in 1895. The party nominated William O. Bradley, the strongest candidate Republicans had fielded in years. Democrats experienced a bitter fight at their convention, which rejected Governor Brown's candidate, choosing to send Pewatt Harding and endorsed a platform supporting the gold standard and sound money. Harding, however, repudiated the Democratic platform, endorsing free silver as a way to keep agrarians in the party. Consequently, Brown refused to campaign for Harding, and conservative Democrats abandoned the party in favor of the Republicans. Populists nominated former Democrat Thomas S. Pettit, and he gained the endorsement of the New South, one of the state's largest black newspapers. Most blacks still, however, remained loyal to Republicans. Bradley further divided Democrats when he sought votes from the American Protective Association, an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic organization, whose 20 to 30,000 voters now favored Republican candidates because Democrats usually drew votes from Catholics and immigrants. When the votes were counted, Bradley had won, receiving 172,436 votes to Harding's 163,524 votes. Populist Pettit got 16,911 votes. His vote total, taken mainly from the Democratic vote, had thrown the election into the Republican camp. The 1895 election began a two-party competition in Kentucky. When legislative and local officers were generally won by Democrats, while legislative and local officers were generally won by Democrats, Republicans won 4 of the next 9 races for governor, and in the 1896 election, a presidential election, Kentucky voters endorsed a Republican for the first time ever, giving William McKinley a slim margin of less than 300 votes over the civil rights populist Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan. While Bryan was a hero to many Kentucky agrarians, he represented a dangerous radical threat to others. Consequently, Democratic leaders, including Watterson, Breckinridge, Carlisle, and Buckner, openly opposed Bryan, causing some Democrats to vote for Republican McKinley and others to cast votes for the National Gold Democratic Party and its nominee, native Kentuckian John M. Palmer. If the 5,108 votes he won gone to Bryan, he would have won Kentucky's electoral vote. The Republicans also elected their first Kentucky member of the U.S. Senate, William J. DeBow. He defeated the Democratic incumbent J.C.S. Blackburn after a bitter battle in the General Assembly that lasted 15 months and took 112 ballots to complete. Republican success resulted because the party realignment was occurring. Republicans, once the Liberal Reform Party, were becoming more conservative, and once conservative Democrats were embracing liberal ideas of reform in most areas except for race. In general, both Kentucky parties were pretty moderate in the end, having reactionary reform wings and refuting extremists. Governor Bradley did not have an overly successful term despite Republican electoral success. He had to devote too much attention to the violence present in the Commonwealth. One problem he faced was the Tollgate Wars. This conflict resulted because over 3/4 of all hard surface roads in Kentucky were built by private companies and operated as toll roads to pay off the company's investment and return a profit to stockholders. Kentuckians generally believed that the toll company's charges were excessive, especially in hard economic times. They demanded that the state build roads and let people use them for free. When state and local governments refused to act, angry citizens burned toll houses, destroyed gates, and threatened and beat employees of the turnpike companies. By 1897, 11 gates had been destroyed in Mercer County. Other counties, mostly in the bluegrass region of central Kentucky, had numerous toll gates destroyed by masked men. Some believed a type of class warfare was occurring. Governor Bradley called for punishment for those attacking the roads, but the Democratic legislature refused to act against the attackers, deferring to local authorities instead. This violence eventually caused the turnpike companies to close. Eventually, most roads were opened to the public free of charge. By 1900, the toll gate war had ended. America went to war with Spain over Cuba in 1898. 4 Kentucky regiments and 2 cavalry troops served in the Spanish-American War, but saw little action. Governor Bradley eventually had to borrow money from a bank to pay for hospital trains to support 6 soldiers back to Kentucky. Overall, 84 Kentuckians died during the conflict, most from sickness rather than battle. William Goble presented problems for Bradley and Republicans in 1898. Politics was Goble's life, and he developed a strong political organization in the state. Brilliant, bold, ambitious, and controversial, he seldom complained, but was successful through sheer force of will. Goble had a new group of young Democrats unhappy with the party's old leadership. They advocated aid for the working classes and greater controls on corporations and their lobbies, particularly the L&N Railroad. Goble developed a reputation as a friend of the common man. While this image appealed to many, Goble's opponents saw him as a ruthless politician who would stop at nothing to gain his objective. In 1899, he ran for the governorship. Previously as a state senator, he had passed the Goble election law in 1898. This legislation established a board of election commissioners whose members were primarily chosen by Goble, which was authorized to choose all local precinct officials and to judge disputed gubernatorial elections. Although Goble won the Democratic nomination in 1899, he angered so many Democrats in the process that they organized a third party called the Honest Election League to oppose Goble. Their candidate was former Governor John Young Brown. Brown and Goble faced Republican William S. Taylor. When the election was over, the Board of Election Commissioners, thought to be controlled by Goble, surprised everyone by saying that Taylor had won the election by slightly more than 2,000 votes. The third party again had taken votes that could have given victory to the Democrats. In December, Taylor was inaugurated and the matter appeared to be over. However, the legislature voted to investigate the election as allegations of fraud had surfaced. 10 of the 11 people selected to serve on the investigative committee were Democrats. Republicans expected the committee to void the election and declare Goble the winner. As Goble walked toward the state capitol on June 30, 1899, he was assassinated and his life would end shortly.